our Node.js UUID problem. This is an extension on the topic of Node.js. We don't actually have a ton of these activities in the course. In fact, most of Node.js is really just kind of teaching you how to program with JavaScript. The idea is that because we get you doing some Node.js problems, which are probably very comfortable to you because it's like writing Python command line terminal stuff, is that you're like, oh, okay, I get the language. Then you can go and apply the language later. But let's have a look at this particular problem. So we have a folder, Node UUID problem, and you can see that inside of that folder, they want us to run npm init. Yep, we'll run npm init, and then we'll go and install the UUID library. What is the UUID library? Well, it's a library that lets you generate UUIDs. Now, UUIDs are just unique identifiers. There's an npm library. I'm sure it'll be up here somewhere. Probably a very popular library, 71 million downloads a week. Another example of a library that I guarantee you is the vast majority of those downloads will come from dependents, not directly. A ton of these libraries would be really basic libraries that would be used by other libraries. UUID as a library is simply something that generates a unique identifier in a particular format. It's really useful for essentially generating string-based identifiers. So think about, if you're familiar with databases like a primary key, it's kind of a little bit overkillish for, you know, if you're creating like user IDs, you don't really need this. Because like, how many users are you going to have? Like, what's the entropy on something like this? That's like massive, right? Where things like this are more useful are things like one of the most common places I'll see these UUIDs are APIs, right? So you imagine there's an API out there like Google Maps, and it's used by, you know, 1 million services, and each service is calling Google Maps' API, you know, 100 times a second from all the different users. So now you've got, you know, 100 million, 100 times a second. So that's like 10 billion every second, say. I'm just making up numbers. This is not really what happens. And then, you know, you have that happen for a whole day. You're talking about, you know, 1 trillion requests an hour based on those BS numbers I just made up. And you're just not going to get that kind of entropy from, not entropy, like scale, you know, bandwidth from a single integer. So that's why these kinds of libraries exist for things like, say, API unique identifiers. So I don't think I finished that example. When you make an API call, quite often it will give you back, or you will provide it with a unique identifier, so that there's forever an ID associated with you making that particular request. So that's an example of this being used. But we could easily go and take this, and I could make a ids.js. Here you go. I'll paste this in, and then I'll go inside my exercise folder, and I'll run that, and it prints out nothing because I didn't console log it. I'll say const id equals that, and then I will console log it, and you'll see that it will be unique every single time I call it. I'm not 100% sure how this is generated, but it's pretty unique, right? You will see that there's this ES6 module syntax and this common JS syntax, and you might try this one sometimes. You might be like, oh, I'll use that, and you're going to get an error, which the error is going to be like, cannot use import statement outside of a module. What's happening here, and you might see this a few times later in the course, so don't stress about it now, is that the import syntax is a newer syntax, and Node, like the standard packaging of Node.js, does not handle it. You have to kind of configure it slightly differently, which is why we use a lot of this require syntax here. In fact, we don't need that. Const v4. Oh, do we? Oh, sorry. Yeah, I thought that was TypeScript. Okay. So yeah, now we've got our IDs. Now let's go back to the activity. So the activity says, open the file, modify the file so that when you run node.js, it outputs 30 randomly generated UUIDs in sorted order, one on each line. That's easy enough. Let's go and create our IDs as a list. Okay. Now we'll go and for const or let I equal 0, I is less than 30, I plus plus. Yes, that is kind of the easiest way to loop 30 times in JavaScript. It's a little bit cumbersome. It's not quite as elegant as Python. IDs.push, UUID v4. So that's us generating one, and then we'll console log IDs. Now, this won't be sorted. It'll just be random stuff. How do we sort these things? Well, what happens if I call .sort? Will that do it? Well, it did, right? So .sort is a function that exists on a JavaScript list or array, and it will sort things based on the rules of the underlying object. So in this case, the UUID is a string. Therefore, it will sort the UUID as a string, which is why you end up with this in kind of like an alphabetical order. Done. After that, print out the 5 most commonly occurring characters, not including dashes, across all of the generated UUIDs. If there are ties, you're allowed to print out more than 5. Okay, so now we want to look through them and essentially do a character count. Well, how do you do a character count? If you remember from, maybe some other scripting you've done, I can create like I use like an object or a dictionary, right? So I'll call it like a frequency count, and it's just going to be an empty dictionary. And then what I can do is I can go through each UUID, const UUID of IDs. Maybe I should call these like UUIDs or something. And what I'll do is I will then go through every character. I'll say for const char of UUID. I don't know if you can loop through character. Let's try and print them out first, just like this. Okay, printed out every single character. What we'll do is we will ignore if the character does not equal a dash. We will print it out like that. So now we get all the characters that aren't dashes. And then what we will do is we will simply say that frequency count of the character plus equals 1. Now we're probably going to get an error here or not. Okay. I know you do in Python. So let's see how, if you've done stuff with Python before. Yeah. Okay. So here's what we need to do. Here's the problem. When I say frequency character count plus equals 1, like this, what this obviously means, and you know this, is that it means that frequency count is equal to frequency count plus 1. The problem is because this isn't defined, because there is no value at that key, because it's just an empty object with no keys. If you try and print this, what you get, right, is you will get JavaScript's magical not a number. You get undefined. And if you try and print undefined, if you try and do something like say print undefined plus 1, let's see what you get. You get not a number. So not a number is a very strange, it's like null. Well, it's not like null, but it's of a similar vein to null. It's just this like placeholder value, which here just says that, yeah, when I add 1 to undefined, I have no idea, but it's definitely not numerical anymore. That's what JavaScript's saying. So what I need to do, as you'd expect, is you do what you do with Python. If this is a bit roundabout. Can I say this? If character is in frequency count, like what I want to do is be able to say if the character is not in, this is Python-esque, if it's not in frequency count, then I want to set its kind of value to 0. Now I can see just from the syntax highlighting that won't work. I'm just kind of taking you through the process. See if this works. Okay, that worked. Seems to work. The other way you can do this is that instead, like a kind of an old school way of doing this, because I believe the in operator is somewhat new, is you would actually go and say, you know what, I'm going to go and get all the keys from my frequency count, and then I'm going to check if it's very JavaScript is not the most elegant. I'm going to go check if the index of that char is not in there. So this is like an old school way of doing this. So what this means is object.keys takes all of the keys of a dictionary or object, turns it into a list. So now I've got a list or array of keys. And then .index of, when you apply that to a list, this is very old school, that essentially says what index is char in that list. So if I have, say, 5 items like A, B, C, D, E, and I say, hey, for this list, what's the index of C? It'll come back with 2 because 0, 1, 2, that's what C is. If I ask it for the index of F, it comes back with -1 because F isn't in there, and -1's how that returns. So what I'm really saying here is, hey, go look through all the keys of frequency count and look for char. And if the index of char is -1, i.e. if it is not in there, then let's set the frequency count to 0. So it's like, oh, okay, there we go. Now we've got that. Well, how do we loop through that? Well, now I would probably go back to my friend Google, JavaScript object sort by key value. How to sort JavaScript objects by key. I don't want to sort them by key. I want to sort them by value. How to sort a JavaScript object by key value. Object.entry sort. Oh, that looks interesting. I don't know why that's an image. It's very strange. Let's play around with this. Let's see what objects.entries frequency count gets us. So if I console log object.entries of frequency count, what do we get? Okay, so you can see that we get this kind of interesting thing. So object.entries turns my dictionary into some kind of like list of lists. So it kind of like it turns each key value into essentially like a tuple. And it slaps it in there. And now when I try and say sort that, right, I can use some funky kind of lambda-esque sorting methods like this one. This is like a sorting function or a comparator. It depends what your background is. If I say like sort AB, A1 minus B1, essentially what this is saying is go and take in the pair and like for each pair compare it, but I want to compare it by index 1, which is the second element. So now we'll see if this should sort my that didn't look like it. Did it sort it? Oh, it did. So I was looking at the wrong thing. Great. So now we got that sorted. It's not what I want. So I'm going to sort the A and B so it sorts it in the right order. Great. So now we have these kind of 5 things here. Cool. And now I can go and say print it out. So now I could say like sorted entries equals that. And I could say, you know, for this won't get me exactly what I want, but for I is 0, I is less than 5, I plus plus, console.log what's my key? My key would be sorted entries I0 appears sorted entries I1 times, like this, I guess. 4 appears 80 times, 5 appears 76 times, D appears 69 times, 9 appears 68 times. So, okay, so I've kind of dealt with that. What we haven't dealt with here is dealing with this particular problem, which is that if there are ties, 6 characters that are equal third, I'm allowed to print out more than 5 characters. I'm allowed to, I'm not going to be required to, so I'm just going to skip over that. And then it says, once you have your program working, install npm install minify, which installs a node-based program that allows us to minify our code, which is something that we do to kind of either obscure our code or to you know, make you wouldn't really do it for a tiny program like this, but you know, it means that it's easier to transmit the file or load the file because you're sending less white space. If I go and look up the minify Node.js library, you'll see that this isn't actually something that I use per se in my code. There's actually like a utility that I use on my library. So if I just type in minify and then the name of my file, I will get the minified output. So if I say, this actually doesn't work very well on Windows because I haven't set things up properly, but if I say minimize that, it kind of complains. So I'm actually just going to preface this with npx to like download it and run it. So there's my minified file, and then I could output that as like ids.min.js. And now I've got my like ids.min.js. So that's like a minified file there. You can see it's also gone and replaced a whole bunch of variables in some cases. It's replaced not everything. It's kept frequency count and stuff there. I assume these minifying libraries have options. Like you could probably like tighten it up and yeah, remove comments and various other things. So it's just another example of how you can use like npm libraries to achieve some kind of goal.